Let me introduce tonight's candidates. Closest to me is Mayor John Fetterman. To his left, is Secretary Katie McGinty. And at the end of the dais is Admiral Joe Sestak. All right, we got that out of our system. All right, we'll begin with opening statements. Each candidate will get 2 minutes. We'll start with Mr. John Fetterman.
Thank you. We Democrats have a special obligation. If you're serious about your commitment to the poor, to those who need some help, including African Americans, we cannot minimize the reality of the lives they lead or take their concerns for granted. You can't just show up at election time and say the right things and think that's enough. We can't start building relationships a few weeks before a vote. We have to demonstrate a sustained commitment to building opportunity, creating prosperity, righting wrongs, and not just every 2 or 4 years, not just when the cameras are on and people are watching, but every single day. Those recent words from Hillary Clinton, I think, perfectly capture the way I've lived and led during my 15 years in Braddock. We have successfully confronted core issues that are at the heart of the current Democratic debate. Mass inequality, perhaps the defining issue of our time. My campaign believes that your zip code should not be your destiny. And I want to be a champion for all of Pennsylvania's forgotten cities. And that's why my campaign has endorsed Bernie Sanders for president. $15 living wage. Nobody on this stage knows better than I do the difference that a well-paying job can make in a community. Universal pre-K. Our 4Kids program in Braddock is the finest pre-K in the state. It closes the achievement gap. Gun violence in Braddock, and like many other communities, they were common. Not anymore. We went 5.5 years without a murder in our community. And other issues that we faced. Eliminating food insecurity through our free store. My wife's rousing story coming from Brazil at age 9, immigration. Effective community policing strategies. And the war on drugs, 2 key issues to the Black Lives Matter movement. And finally, LGBT rights, as I was the first elected official in the state to officiate a same-sex wedding when it was still illegal in 2013. We believe we have the strongest campaign to beat Pat Toomey because we are the most progressive campaign. And we're here to earn your support, and we are grateful for the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Katie McGinty, and I'm here this evening to ask for your support. I am in this race to fight for people, to fight for families, the middle class that is so squeezed in this country now to the point of near non-existence. This week gave us stark evidence as to what is really at stake in this election. Not hours after Justice Scalia passed away, Mitch McConnell made clear what the Republican agenda is. It is about partisanship and obstruction. It is not about families, and it is not about progress. Now, our own Pat Toomey had a choice. He could have stood for families. He could have stood for principle and the people of Pennsylvania. Instead, he threw in with Mitch McConnell. And in fact, he even went further and made clear that not even the strict constructions of our own Constitution would make him get to work on behalf of his constituents. His obstructionism brought on a whole lot of heat, but did our senator moderate or back down? No, he doubled down, and yesterday told the press that we shouldn't mislead the American people, that any of this is about the qualifications of a nominee. It's about politics and his partisanship and his anti-family and working person agenda. We know that Pat Toomey is about packing the court to take away a woman's right to choose. He's about packing the court to take away health care. He's about packing the court to reverse marriage equality. He's about packing the court to take away the right to organize and collectively bargain for a living wage, for decent benefits. His agenda is anti-middle class, it's anti-family. We cannot let Pat Toomey win, and with your help, I will not let him win. Thank you very much.
My whole life has been one of service. Nothing will ever match walking on the ground in Afghanistan at the beginning of that conflict when I was head of the Navy's anti-terrorism unit, leading the youth of America into combat in harm's way and bringing them back safely. But something comes close. During that savage recession, over 18,000 of my fellow countrymen and women walked into my district office, 4 times any other congressional office. Their livelihoods were being harmed. We kept that office open till late at night and throughout the weekends to take care of them. At the other end of 95 in Washington, D.C., I fought hard for that economic stimulus bill so teachers could keep their jobs to teach our kids. I fought hard for that infrastructure bill, and then for the Affordable Care Act. Very dear to me that everyone in any city or any county throughout Pennsylvania now has access to health care. I fought hard for Medicaid expansion, so when Tom Wolf took office, all he had to do was sign it and get 500,000 more Pennsylvanians covered. When I left office, I still wanted to serve, and I turned down all those lucrative lobbying and consulting jobs. I went to teach at 5 universities, but also went to Plowshares, which had to do with the elimination of nuclear weapons. I went to work for the Center of Refugee Affairs and Disaster Relief because I saw such devastation around this world. I went to work at a nonprofit in Philadelphia, and there I worked for the underserved to bring education to them. Secretary Clinton asked me to be on a special panel that could work with China in the one project the Assistant Secretary of State said actually worked with China. I turned back all my pay raises as a congressman, and I also turned back anything that I was given from those nonprofits. I am rich in service, and that's why I'm running for the Senate again. To bring that breadth and depth of experience that no one running in this nation has of foreign affairs, nor in the United States Senate. To understand that our militaries can stop a problem, but we never fix it. And second, I never again want to see those 18,000 citizens walk in another congressman's office. We must restore their dream.
Okay, we'll move on to our question set. Each candidate will get 90 seconds to answer the question. We'll start. The order is in alphabetical by last name, starting with Ms. McGinty. And then we'll do 30-second rebuttals if needed. The first question will come from Anisha Singh from the Center for American Progress.
Thank you very much. My question is, with the news of a new United States Supreme Court vacancy, our federal courts are more important than ever before. While we hope that the current president will be granted his constitutional right to appoint Justice Scalia's replacement, the fact of the matter is the next president could also appoint up to 3 more United States Supreme Court justices, changing the entire landscape of our courts for a generation. An important role of the United States Senator in the federal courts process is to provide advice and consent to the president when it comes to nominations of federal judges. Currently, there are 5 district court and 1 circuit court vacancy in Pennsylvania, and obstruction is at an all-time high, with the slowest confirmation rate since 1960 and the largest backlog of cases in history. If you are elected, what kind of nominees would you suggest to the president, and what steps would you take to champion those nominees?
Thank you very much. Look, in Pat Toomey's obstructionism, what we see is a deliberate effort to try to make the Supreme Court of the United States an extension of Republican partisan politics. As a United States Senator, you bet I would ask some tough questions of any and every nominee. I would make sure that any nominee understood that our Constitution guarantees a women's right to choose. I would make sure that any nominee understands that our Constitution includes a right of association. That includes then the right to organize and collectively bargain so that people have a shot at decent wages. I would make sure that any nominee understood that our environment, a clean environment, a safe environment, is essential to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that they get that law. But maybe first and foremost, and I think what drives Pat Toomey most here, I would make sure that any nominee understood that Citizens United was some of the worst jurisprudence ever written. It is not good law, and that it is all about making our democracy drown in dark money. Pat Toomey's dark money super PAC friends, I'd make sure any nominee understood a real Constitution respects and protects one person, one vote, and makes that real again in our country.
The question now goes to Mr. Sestak.
Nisha, I've read your Center of American Progress report on that, where Pennsylvania was dead last of all the states in far as filling its judicial responsibilities and vacancies. This is important because the branch of government that most shapes the character of America is not the legislative or the executive branch. It is the judicial branch, because eventually everything goes to court, even a presidential election. Senator Specter said it well. Except for the decision to go for war, the vote that is most important is who takes over that Supreme Court vacancy. Look, I think there needs to be three important things. First, while there's no single litmus test, whoever is nominated, at least by me, will have to meet the correct criteria of representing the character of America, and that character is embodied in its soul, we the people. Two great tenets sit under that soul, rugged individualism, but always aligned with the commonwealth. We're in it together. And so that person has to understand that, yes, anyone who wants to marry anyone of either sex is the right approach. Second, voting rights is absolutely something that needs work, and a woman's right to choose is absolutely critical. Second, I want to ensure that while everyone up there in that Supreme Court, for example, has an Ivy League degree from a law school, I think we need a little more diversity. And third, what I would like is to have something that Judge Scalia, and that he worked well and went on vacation with Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Battle, debate of ideas, but let's make sure we come together, and I have to do it civilly. Thank you.
Mr. Fetterman?
Hey, I'm proud to say that I wore litmus tests in this case, because you think of all things that are near and dear to us as progressives, they're constantly under siege by the court system. You think how close we came to losing the Affordable Care Act. You think how close we came to not having marriage equality in the United States. All came down to the Supreme Court. So my key litmus tests for any justice that I would approve, first and foremost, Citizens United, the single greatest threat to our American democracy. Getting the poisonous influence of money out of our politics is the most important thing we can do in this generation for future generations. Second litmus test I'm inflexible on is a woman's right to choose. How many different states across this country have enacted restrictive laws to make abortion harder and harder for women to secure? In Texas, you have to drive 500 miles for one. Thirdly, as Katie mentioned, the right to organize. That has to also be enshrined as an ideal for the Supreme Court. And finally, our fourth greatest threat is climate. Because any climate agreement, any climate deal is going to end up at the Supreme Court. And can we all agree that if 100 out of 100 climate scientists agree that this is a major issue, and will you rule in favor of proactive legislation on climate change? Thank you.
Ms. McGinty, do you have a rebuttal?
I think we're good. Thanks.
It's very good.
All right. Our second question comes from the Women's Law Project, and that would be Tara Murphy. Murtha.
Hey, thank you. The The Women's Law Project is proud to be here today as a member of the Pennsylvania Campaign for Women's Health, a group of more than 50 organizations advocating for women's health and economic security in Pennsylvania. Working women still earn significantly less than their male counterparts and face serious challenges in the workplace as they are pregnant or parenting. Those burdens are especially heavy on low-income women and women of color. I'd like to ask you, what have you done to help working women get paid a fair wage and receive fair treatment when they are pregnant or caring for a family? And specifically, do you support the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the Paycheck Fairness Act, and the Raise the Wage Act? Thank you.
I co-sponsored and voted for the Paycheck Fairness Act. I also voted for, which finally got passed through the Senate, the Little Ledbetter Act. And the minimum wage we raised in my second vote, I believe, down there in Congress, where we increased it about 40%. But you are spot on. A Latina makes 54 cents on the dollar of a white male. An African-American woman makes 65 cents for a white male. And overall, it's 77 cents. The act that I want to fix most is a Pregnancy Discrimination Act, because that law that was passed 50-some years ago has a loophole in it that you could drive a Mack truck through. And the reason this is so important is understand that 2/3 of those on minimum wage are actually adults, and 2/3 of them are women. And they can be laid off at a heartbeat's notice when 1 out of every 5 person who's gotten their job back is only a part-time job. And if somebody wants a full-time job because a woman wants to step over and take care of having a baby, she can be fired under the PDA because of the loophole that's in it. Look, I fought hard for that Affordable Care Act. As all of you know, my daughter had brain cancer. I've got into Congress only to pay back this nation. When women in that Affordable Care Act no longer have to pay twice as much as a male. And Latinas, for example, that have higher rates of diabetes or heart failure actually get covered. And we put in their ethnicity to make sure that when we measure the effectiveness of our health care plan, we measure it for everyone. And there's so much more to be done, and I want to continue that fight.
Mr. Fetterman?
I actually got my start in my current career trajectory helping young women of color that were pregnant and or had children at the time. In 1995, I taught GED classes in Pittsburgh's Hill District, and I helped young parents that were either forced out of school or had to quit because of circumstances earn their GEDs. And people don't realize that for every GED that you earn over $200,000 over the course of your working lives. I've been grounded in that for the past 20 years. And of course, I support all the laws that protect women in pregnancy. But I think the single biggest thing that we can do for women is what we can do for society as a whole, and fight for a $15 minimum wage and a living wage for everybody. And let me just say that's the floor, that's not the ceiling. And that fight begins with each and every one of us there, because we don't have to live off $8 or $9 an hour. The Republicans definitely don't have to live off $8 or $9 an hour. $15 an hour minimum wage is one of the defining issues in our time, especially for women, especially for single mothers that in many cases far too often are the sole breadwinners for their family. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, not too long ago, I stood with a young mother in Pittsburgh as we kicked off a major campaign in the fight for 15. You know, she's emblematic as to what's going on in this world today. She's working not one, but two low-wage jobs. She was standing there talking about her 5-year-old son that she is also trying to raise. Here's the deal. It's about, one, not being paid a fair, decent wage. Two, we have to go even beyond the wages, because she can't predict the hours that she's going to be working. If she doesn't step back and hold 40 hours a week for the promise of getting 5 hours here or 10 hours there, she's fired. We need thorough non-discrimination in the workplace. We certainly need a living wage. And I will tell you, as I heard about that little boy, he deserves to see his mother. That family has earned both a living wage and equal pay for equal work. You know, John's right, too. We get all of these myths about the minimum wage. Geez, if the minimum wage only kept pace with inflation, we probably would be looking at $20. in terms of the minimum wage today. But beyond that, in terms of health care, I was very proud working with Governor Wolf, pushing forward and expanding Medicaid. We saved the CHIP program. Thank you, 500,000 people. We saved the Children's Health Insurance Program, and we got rid of the absolutely awful, unjustified asset test that was stealing food out of the mouths of children.
Mr. Sestak, would you like everybody?
Yeah, there's 2 points I'd like to add. Keep in mind there's other areas. Women represent 33% of all small business owners today. And yet, of all bank loans to small business last year, only 3.5% went to women small businesses. And federal contracts, 25% of them are supposed to go to small businesses, and yet that 1/3 of small business women only got 4% of all those contracts. And that Affordable Care Act, we ensured that we also had in there free exams, prenatal, et cetera, to make sure the health of our children by our mom is taken care of. And finally, it was my legislation as chairman of the Small Business Committee that helped to develop even more women business development centers to expand from what we have, and which Pat Toomey has voted against consistently.
I recently came across a study that calculated the average net wealth of African American women in their 30s to 40. And you know what that net worth was? $5. $5. Look it up online. You know, what does that say us as a nation? You know, we need a revolution when women in their 30s are worth a net $5. When the richest 20 Americans have more wealth than the combined bottom 40% of this country. Something is wrong and we need a revolution.
Thank you, Bernice. There's one other piece of this that I do want to add. Not long ago, I was in Scranton and sitting with a group of families and people from the community. You know, in many instances, because we are not paying young people or young professionals a decent wage, grandparents are now taking care of those children, those grandchildren. And this woman stood and told me her greatest fear is that Pat Toomey will win in his agenda to privatize Social Security. Social Security represents 90% of her income. She will be on the street if Pat Toomey has his way. That's a women's agenda. That's a family agenda as well. Protecting Social Security.
Okay. Our next question comes from Carmen Alexander from New Voices.
Good evening. Thank you, Keystone Progress, for this opportunity. Reproductive justice is the human right to control your own body. It's critically important to New Voices and to 1.5 million women of color in Pennsylvania. With unending political and policy attacks at the federal level on an Affordable Care Act, abortion coverage, contraceptive access, paid parental leave, and gender-based violence, reproductive justice is needed more now than ever. If elected senator, how will you champion reproductive justice for women of color who are disproportionately affected and all people?
The first question goes to Mr. Fetterman.
Sure. Specifically to your question, championing it for women of color, I'm mayor of a small town in western Pennsylvania, Braddock, which is actually 80% African American. And in 2009, we lost our health care. If anyone's ever heard of UPMC, if you haven't yet, you sure will, because they're a $12 billion health juggernaut and they're hell-bent on taking over health care in Pennsylvania. And in 2009, they closed our hospital. They closed it and we lost medical care for all the residents in the area. And it took me 5 years, but I fought to regain access to quality, comprehensive medical care for all of our residents in the area. Nothing is more sacred to me than a woman's right to choose and a woman's right to family planning services. Planned Parenthood has been under siege nonstop. That must stop, and we must rise to the occasion and defend Planned Parenthood as the amazing organization that it is. Thank you. A woman's right to choose is enshrined by the Supreme Court, and that also is paramount and must be protected. And we must take the offensive to roll back all of these punitive, petty amendments and bills that are being rolled out across states of America, making women's access to abortion much more difficult than it needs to be. We need to stand up for these issues because reproductive justice is important to all of us, not just women. Thank you.
Ms. McGinty?
Thank you. Well, I'm the mom of 3 teenage daughters, and when I think of their future, I know one thing for sure. They are beautiful, talented, very capable young ladies, and I will fight to my dying breath for their ability to have their own self-determination, to have the ability to build their future and make their choices in accordance to their values and their dreams. And I will tell you, I will do the same for any young woman in any part of this country or the world. You know, I've also had the great opportunity to live and work overseas, and I've lived in countries where the loss of empowerment by women is an extremely serious and I would say lethal thing. Countries where the demographic splits are such that there are literally tens of millions of missing women because society decided they weren't valuable to that country. This is an abomination and a disgrace, and I will fight with every fiber of my energy and being to ensure a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to be paid decently and equally, a woman's right to choose her own course, to her own self-empowerment and her own destiny. This we cannot compromise on. And I will tell you, in foreign policy, there's a big piece of this too. We'll fight ISIS, but guess what? I want to lead a Malala agenda to make sure every young girl is educated, can read, has skills and tools to succeed. That's how we grow and prosper. Thank you very much.
Mr. Sestak?
I have believed in a woman's right to choose every day of my life. I'm a Catholic, and the Cardinal forbade my high school after I became a congressman, even though I'm in their Hall of Fame. I don't know why, to ever visit my high school. I've been disinvited because of him from 4 Catholic colleges while a congressman, as well as several other Catholic high schools. And I love my faith, but it is a woman's right to choose. I worked hard down there, also advocating that women overseas in the military, they must be permitted in military hospitals to have the right to choose, which they cannot, and often are there in a foreign, desolate country. I voted for planning services for overseas, not just here at home. It's why NARAL, now, and Planned Parenthood all supported me. But there's so much more than that. Women, we bring in 30 to 60,000 young women into this country every year to be sex slaves. I voted and co-sponsored for the International Violence Against Women Act, which Pat Toomey has absolutely refused to move forward on. 10,000 young girls, at least to 15, are put into the sex slaves every year. That's why I did an event in Bucks County, which is a major conduit for that trade. Think about their right to choose, not even how they live. There's so much to be done, and to get that IAVA, much like we got that Violence Against Women's Act here at home passed, we must do that. Thank you.
Mr. Fetterman, do you have a rebuttal?
No, I don't.
No, me.
May I add one thing to what Katie added, and to my opening comments about militaries can stop a problem, but we cannot fix a problem. I was on that ground in Afghanistan early in the conflict, and then I went back to visit again. If we had done something to fix the illiteracy rate of women, which is 98% in Afghanistan, we would have done more to secure the peace in Afghanistan than we would have just to stop the war with our military. That's what she's talking about. And that, more than anything, is what we need, people who understand that. Thank you.
Our next question comes from the audience. What will you do to fight the influence of big money in politics? The question goes first to Ms. McGinty.
Thank you very much. As I said at the outset, dark money and money in politics really threatens our democracy more than just about anything else. It is drowning out a person's right to have their voice heard. It's at the root as to why in this Commonwealth, while we have a million Democratic voter registration advantage, that gerrymandering holds sway, and that gerrymandering eviscerates one person, one vote. It's the reason why, you step back and you say, well, why the heck is it that we have an economy that doesn't work for people anymore? All you have to do is follow the money. It's about Citizens United. It's about that dark money. It's about those secret checks. People say, how could it be that in today's day and age, people are getting paid the same as they were essentially 40 years ago, while tuition has increased and healthcare costs have increased? Well, all you have to do is look at the fact that for the CEOs in the 80s made 30 times the amount of the average employee. Today, they make 400 times the amount of the average employee. That's something we can't afford. That is brought to you by Koch brothers money. That is brought to you by secret campaign contributions, and I will do everything in my power to end that and restore the real promise of democracy.
Mr. Sestak?
I believe if you take money out of politics, you'd fix about 80% of the problems. When I got to Congress, I immediately submitted a bill that said there should be public financing of campaigns. When Citizens United came out, I submitted a bill that said within a week, look, I understand constitutionally now we're saying that corporations are people, but people actually own those corporations. Just like we voted for Save for Pay on executives, we should have where the shareholders should have to vote on any ad a corporation wants to put out and approve to who it goes against. But there's more than that. We need senators and congressmen who absolutely would not take a lobbying or consulting job as a revolving door. Whether it's down there in Washington, D.C., as over 400 senators and congressmen have done, or whether it's in Harrisburg. Look, I got to be vice chairman of the Small Business Committee as a freshman. Normally it takes 14 years. I thought they wanted to show they had a sense of humor. Nah. Nobody goes to small business, even though it creates 70% of all jobs, because there's no PAC money for small businesses. This is a stain on the soul of both of our parties. What I believe is this, that we should have laws that actually say nobody, once they serve, should ever be allowed to use their service, military or Congress or anywhere else, to enrich themselves. You are a public servant. And that's why I turned down those lobbying jobs. Although my wife put her hand when I told her what one of the industries was, and she put her hand on my shoulder when I told the 6 and 7 figures I was offered and said, Joe, are you sure? I'm sure.
Mr. Fetterman?
Could I see a show of hands? How many people think there's too much money in politics? Okay, you can all relax because it's much worse than you think. And again, I didn't really fully realize that till I ran for office myself. The effect of money on politics, it's like oxygen. It's everywhere. You can't get away from it. It's shocking, quite frankly. And I think that commitment against big money influence starts with the campaign that you have. My campaign is powered exclusively by grassroots donors, and we have thousands and thousands of donors that kick in $5, $10, $15 at a time. It's routinely, we get handwritten notes with $5 bills or $10 bills inside saying we can't afford any more than this, but we believe in your race. And as a senator, I think the most important thing we can do to fight against the influence of money is to rail against Citizens United with everything that we got. And if we are lucky enough to be able to weigh in on the Supreme Court nominee, that person needs to understand that Citizens United has to fall, democracy has to return to this country, and we should stop allowing billionaires to shop for candidates the way you and I would shop for a laptop computer. Thank you.
Ms. McKenzie, rebuttal?
I'm good, thank you.
I'm good.
All right. Okay, our next question is also from the audience. Single-payer health care would save money and provide comprehensive health coverage for all. Are you in favor? All right. The question goes first to Mr. Sestak.
As I mentioned, I got into this business. I was an independent, had no desire to be in politics. The only reason I got in was because my daughter was given an 8% chance to survive her brain cancer after the first line operations at Walter Reed. I walked outside that hospital and looked up at the sky when they said she only had 3 to 9 months and said, Lord, just take me. But it doesn't work that way. After we took care of her, that little warrior, stronger than me, I became a Democrat because I thought this party would fight for universal health care for everyone. I took what's now called, in 2006, Romney Care, stuck it on my website and said, that's what I'm running for. National security begins at home. Everyone should have that in a Republican district. And as George knows, I won my second election fighting hard for that by 20 points, spending only $28,000 on yard signs. I believe in the objective that single payers believe in, which is get rid of those insurance companies. And that's how we fix the Affordable Care Act. That Affordable Care Act has in it co-ops that replaced the public option, that we were unable to get through that darn Senate. And now you go to Maine, and that co-op, which insurance companies are forbidden to be in a co-op, all that money is now turned into the co-op for health care. You go to Maine, and everyone, 80% of those in the individualized states, Obamacare is in that co-op and expanding into another state. That's the thoughtful, progressive way to do it through the Affordable Care Act, I believe. But I'll fight every day to keep that health care plan that gives everybody an opportunity my daughter did in the United States Senate. Thank you.
Okay.
Say again?
Mr. Fetterman?
Yeah. Yes, let me just go on and take this opportunity to thank President Obama for the Affordable Care Act. As even he would concede, the law is far from perfect, but it affected me and my family very deeply because prior to the Affordable Care Act, my wife and I didn't have insurance. And as soon as we were able to, we bought a policy on the exchange, and about 3 months later, my lovely wife, sitting right there, twisted her ankle and broke a bone in her foot. And our family would have been wrecked medically because of the bills coming in, and she probably wouldn't have been able to get the care that she received as a result. So I am grateful for the Affordable Care Act. That being said, we are the only country in the world of an industrialized nature that doesn't recognize health care as a fundamental right. Everybody gets sick, everybody needs health care. Single payer is the ideal that we should all move towards. But I'm also very grateful for the Affordable Care Act. Does everybody know that there are more pharmaceutical lobbyists in Washington, D.C. than there are members of Congress? Do you know that each one of them spends $273,000 per member of Congress? And why do they do that? So we can't negotiate drug prices with Medicare. That's a $50 billion gift to the drug industry every year. That must stop. And that is one of the things that can help offset the expense to pay for single-payer, affordable health care for everybody. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry.
sorry.
You have an answer.
Thank you. Healthcare is a fundamental and essential right, and I want to take on very directly the muscle of Big Pharma. You know, my family was among those families that had the family meeting when my sister, God rest her soul, who was suffering from terminal brain cancer. And we went to one service provider, and the drug that she was being prescribed literally would have cost tens of thousands of dollars every couple of months. And so we all, as a family of 10 kids, got around the table and figured out who could remortgage their home, who could put off college for a year, who had what money. That's a disgraceful, disgraceful situation. These are drugs that our taxpayers, our tax dollars, go to discovering and inventing and developing. And yet we get taken to the cleaners on the front end in discovering the drugs and in the back end of having to remortgage our house or see a loved one to their grave prematurely because we pay in excess of any other country in the world for those drugs. That's wrong. It has to stop. I agree, single payer would squeeze so much of the excessive cost out of our healthcare system. But I'll tell you today, I'm focused on a Pat Toomey who not once, but probably 70 times now, has tried to take away that fundamental right to health care, a right that now ensures that women aren't discriminated against and ensures that people aren't kicked out for having a pre-existing condition. This country needs to hold its head high, ensure that one of the most basic fundamental rights, the right to decent health care, is there and available to every man, woman, and child in this country.
Mr. Sestak, I think you have a rebuttal.
Yes, on the farmer question, to add on what John said, look, in the next 10 years, $129 billion will have to be paid because we cannot negotiate with the pharmaceuticals for Medicare, but we can for the VA and for Medicaid. I can get a drug at the VA for probably half the price most of the times as compared to Medicare. But think about this, pay for delay. These brand name pharmaceuticals pay generic companies not to produce the drugs. We lose $3.5 billion every year as their patent comes out. And then we don't permit, like Vermont does, to take in drugs that are FDA approved from Canada because the pharmaceuticals won't let us. That's $400 every year for seniors that they save up there, but we should do it nationwide.
Mr. Fetterman?
Yeah. Let that sink in. $273,000 per member of Congress. That is remarkable. That's over $250,000 a year that the pharmaceutical industry spends lobbying Congress. Does money buy influence? I don't know. To the tune of $50 billion a year. So next time someone says, well, we can't afford single payer, it's like, the hell we can't.
Ms. McGinty?
Thank you. You know, Pennsylvania, unfortunately, is seeing, like so many places in this country, the scourge of addiction and opiate addiction and the terrible loss of young life. Pat Toomey says that he's among those who just cares and feels terribly about the fact that so many families are suffering that addiction. But you know, you can't have it both ways. You can't fight to repeal the Affordable Care Act that for the first time put on a parity mental, behavioral health, addiction health with physical ailments and said, finally, we as a country will stand by those families suffering this scourge. Pat Toomey, if you really care about those families, stand up and support the Affordable Care Act and health care for all.
Our next question is also from the audience. What will you do to make sure the U.S. meets its moral obligations with respect to climate change? Mr. Fetterman, you're first.
Sure. I really do consider climate change a moral imperative. But there's also a very practical one. How many planets do we have to live on currently? And it is a huge, huge threat. We don't argue about the science of electricity. We don't argue about the science of the microprocessor. Why are we arguing as a country about climate science? 101 out of 100 climate scientists say this is a huge, huge deal here. And why aren't we acting as a country? Whenever you are acting irrationally, you have to stop and think, why? We only have one Earth, and everyone agrees it's a huge problem. It's like, follow the money. You know, and it's a pair of brothers, the Koch brothers, and the oil and gas industry that is spending billions of dollars to stop meaningful climate change in action. You want to know something else? Some of the most important environmental legislation that's been passed over the last 40 years has happened with Republican presidents in office. The Montreal Protocol, the sulfur acid rain, tradable permits. All these different things, getting lead out of paint and gasoline, have occurred with Republican presidents. We need to bring the Republicans back to common sense. We need to bring them to the table because we only have one planet and it's under siege thanks to climate change.
Ms. McGinty?
Thank you. Well, this is an issue that I am proud to have spent my entire professional career working on. Way back in the 1980s, starting in 1989, working with then Senator Al Gore and organizing some of the very first hearings in the United States Senate on this critical issue, and then serving as a delegate in the negotiation of some of the key climate change treaties. The bottom line is we have to break through this old myth that the polluters try to freeze us with, that, okay, if you act on the environment, it's going to cost you your job. There's never been anything so untrue. And you know what? When I was Secretary of Environmental Protection here in Pennsylvania, we proved it because we were a recognized leader in the environment. Did it hurt our economy? No. We became #1 in the country in wind energy jobs, #3 in the country in solar energy jobs. We pushed and became a recognized leader in energy efficiency, dialed down pollution, and did it save taxpayers money? $300 million of real savings in dialing down electricity bills as well. You know, you do have to get a kick out of these guys. When it comes to climate, they either completely deny or they say, well, geez, I'm not a scientist. As a chemist, I love that. But even more, as a woman, I love that on climate, they're not a scientist, we can't do anything. But when it comes to women's health, they're an MD and a PhD.
Mr. Sestak?
Climate change is the #1 strategic livable issue our planet and our nation has. It is a national security issue. Even our Pentagon last year said one of the greatest sources of conflict we will have to face in the decades to come will be because of climate change. As the Arctic melts, there is a fight for resources that will happen up there. The Navy last month requested permission to replace its biplanes up in Iceland that can track underwater vessels in the Arctic. The greatest sources of conflict will come from the drought and other types of areas. But this is why I was for a moratorium on fracking in 2010, and I am today. Even our Solicitor General, Eugene T. Pasquale, said our DEP was not ready to handle. It was undermanned, understaffed, didn't have the proper regulations, and could not enforce it. And how can we be doing something like that when the Halliburton loophole won't even let the EPA come in under the look at the Safe Drinking Water Act and a law passed in 2005. This is not Flint. It should not be Flint. 84% of all those chemicals those companies put on their website, at least one of those 84% of companies put it on, at least one chemical is not disclosed. I learned in the military, piss poor planning gives piss poor results. This is about expect what you inspect. It's why I voted for a cap-and-trade bill down there in the United States Senate, and yet I represented a Republican district, and it didn't make any difference, because when you explain it to them logically, they understand. The United States Navy is raising its piers in Norfolk, Virginia, because 2 decades from now, our carriers won't even be able to tie up because of the rise in the oceans. This is our call, everyone, Democrats, Republicans, and independents.
I didn't mention earlier that we have a bell if candidates go over, and we're not afraid to use it.
Uh-oh. They're getting tougher on us.
Okay. We'll start the rebuttal round. Mr. Fetterman, you have any rebuttal?
Yeah, if you want to have a really good lesson, study lead in our economy. And you go back and you study that it was in gasoline, it was in paint. And you read and study just how strongly the industry fought getting lead out of these things. And it seems crazy in retrospect to look at it when you realize just how toxic and devastating it is. The same thing is true for carbon. We need to fight big industry influence. We need to get money out of politics. It is a huge, huge issue, and the only way we can get to that is to get the money out of it.
You know, as I think about how we were successful on key legislation, again, when I was secretary, putting in place the toughest regulations or some of the toughest regulations in the country in cutting toxic mercury pollution from power plants, or moving forward and having some of the toughest regulations with respect to water quality. It's often about building coalitions. And I guess on climate change, I think there is a national security coalition to be built to bring those voices to the table, but also public health. When you look at the Zika virus, you know, these are vector-borne diseases. Which vectors propagate in warm and moist climates? That's climate change. That's a public health threat as well.
In my time in the military, I visited over 80 countries, places like Djibouti. My wife is an international environmentalist working in Africa, in the former Soviet Union countries. The devastation that is out there, and to see the poverty, aggravated soon by climate change and even more, and droughts, this is a harbinger for a moment for us to stand up and bring it back home. She's right. This is U.S. leadership bringing together the coalition of the world. This is where the United States leadership is most desired, both in the Senate, but also throughout this world. We're all in this together.
The next question is from the audience. What is your stance on the Trans-Pacific Partnership? And we'll start with Ms. McGinty.
Thank you. I'm fundamentally opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the fast track that preceded it. You know, we have for 30 years been throwing these Hail Mary passes and say, oh, just one more agreement, then we'll get our market share. What have we seen? We've seen an evisceration of market share. We've seen the loss of manufacturing. We've seen the loss of family-sustaining jobs, and we've seen the loss of the middle class. We've got the biggest market in the world. I, for one, would just like to see us invest back in our own country, in our own economy. How about putting people to work in good, family-paying infrastructure jobs? Let's build that modern infrastructure, roads, bridges, water. For God's sake, wouldn't it have been better to put $100 million into ripping out the old lead pipes than now having to spend it on an emergency basis when thousands of little beautiful babies have lead poisoning? Let's get to work on a super grid and a smart grid. And you know what? Let's be willing to tell China, you are full of you know what in terms of manufacturing today is not about cheap labor. It's about skilled labor. And nobody can compete against the men and women who work in these United States. Coupled with our technology, it's our turn to put our folks back to work with decent, family-sustaining jobs and stop being the walking mat of the world where we give and give and give and we lose and lose and lose. It's time for us to win again, and that means no TPP.
Mr. Fetterman?
Yeah, I thought I would leave this world never saying this phrase, but Ross Perot was actually right about something. You know, remember his famous phrase about NAFTA, you're going to hear a giant sucking sound, and that's going to be jobs going down to Mexico. And he was right, you know. And the TPP is just NAFTA redux, brought back for the new millennium, and it would have a devastating impact on working families across Pennsylvania. I live across the street from the last steel mill in Pittsburgh, and that's a remarkable statement to make. That'd be like the last brewery in Milwaukee. And that's no accident. That's because of our trade policies. I'm all for fair trade, but all we're getting is free trade, and free trade is synonymous with we will screw you over and we will dump our steel and we will put you out of business. And if you don't believe me, look at U.S. Steel's stock price. If that mill in our town, the Edgar Thomson, Andrew Carnegie's First, goes out of business and we lose that tax revenue, I, as mayor, am going to have to choose. Which do you want today, folks? Police or crossing guards? And I don't want to make that choice. I am strongly opposed to the TPP, and I would be a strong, strong fighter for fair trade, something we've never had in this country. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Ms. McGinty?
I just want to say,
Can I give it 30 seconds?
Oh, you didn't go.
It's all right. I met my wife, and 2 days later, I re-saw her for the second time, and I said, "Hi, Susan." She said, "Have I met you?" That was a joke.
It was a good one,
But
too.
it's true. May I? Thank you. I am not a supporter of the TPP. How can you be when our intellectual property is not protected in it? When 7 of the 11 nations that are involved in it have minimum wage less than $3. When a company can sue a government, much like that Canadian company is suing the U.S. government today for $15 billion because we rightly closed the XL pipeline. Look, however, I am supportive of President Obama's objective of trying to build a coalition of those nations in ASEAN. Why? It's a national security issue. And that's why we have to retool the TPP. China already has an infrastructure bank trying to dominate that region of the world, as well as elsewhere that Britain has joined. There has been 4 naval conflicts already out there in the South China Sea, as China has said, we own, China owns, the South China Sea because there's 19 trillion cubic feet of natural gas underneath it. This is about economics right now. And we need to have those nations bound to us, to where we set the international rules of the road, because China is not abiding by them, as it has already built 4 artificial aircraft upon which it is already landing aircraft. It's why our president has moved 60% of our Navy to the Western Pacific. It's a national security issue. But I believe with the right approach, you can have a TPP, as John said, that is free trade for us, by binding that coalition, not in a Cold War way, but to make sure China follows the rules of the road. Thank you.
I apologize, Mr. Sestak. I only have 3 people to keep up with it, apparently.
That's all right. We're not married. It was more serious with my wife.
Too much for me. All right, now rebuttal. Ms. McGinty, would you like-
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is another area where just pointing out in terms of what's Pat Toomey's agenda. On so many issues, he works directly against the interest of his own constituents. We see that in his relentless attack on Planned Parenthood, 104,000 Pennsylvanians depending on Planned Parenthood for their health care, yet he tries to end it. Same with his effort to try to repeal Medicaid. In the trade context, he led the charge to get rid of the Ex-Im Bank. What is it? It is something that tries to level the playing field for our manufacturers. He was warned, please don't do it. 40,000 jobs in Pennsylvania are at stake. He did it anyway, and GE is one example. After that, let go 1,500 hardworking Pennsylvanians. That's courtesy of Pat Toomey.
I'll do it out of order. Rebuttal, Mr. Fetterman?
There's an underlying issue here, and that is our nation puts less into training and retraining than any developed nation in the OECD. Less. And the $18 billion we used to put in was called wasteful, duplicative by the GAO. The last great social compact we need is training and education for a lifetime. There's too much disruption in this globalization of the world not to invest like we do in the military. Come on in as a cook and flip burgers. By the time you leave, you're a 4-star chef. That's the type of investment we need for training and retraining in a globalized world where disruptions will be under our control.
Just to add a note, we are trending on Twitter.
Slow night.
Trending.
First on that one, right?
I don't know. Yes, I did.
Okay, our next question is from Twitter. How about that? Keystone Progress is dedicated to dismantling racism. What will you do to fight systemic racism? The first question goes to you.
Yes,
Mr.
we
Sen-
do have a systemic problem. How do we know? It isn't just the judicial system and the criminal injustice system. Look, you take children of color, African American, who are in pre-K. Almost 40% of those suspended from pre-K are children of color. Look at those who are in IDEA, disabled, development, in education. 50% of those who are put into restraints are children who are African American. Something is wrong systemically. I visit a prison every year on Veterans Day for the last 10 years because I didn't want people to think I forgot them just because I wasn't a congressman. Go in there and visit with them and wonder why some of them are there with those crazy little inane laws that put someone there for such a small quantity of drugs. 2 of the first 3 people I hired for my staff were African American, one a woman, one a man who was incarcerated for years, and he's mighty fine. I go to an African American church 2 or 3 or 4 sometimes every weekend. I did as a congressman. Well, my party wouldn't let me come into Philadelphia Democratic events when I ran against Senator Specter. But the African American community welcomed me. And that's why I went to Cheney University, the oldest historical black university, first, to show them that I owed them. Half the people under the age of 3 years old today are children of color. They will be our largest national asset in 15 years. If they aren't our largest national asset, not in terms of only numbers, but in quality of education and health care, we don't make it. This is about all lives, yes, but let me tell you, Black lives matter.
Mr. Fetterman?
Yeah, you can't answer that question before you affirm that Black lives matter. And since 1995, I have made that my life's work in order to affirm that very sentiment. Long before it was ever coined, thank you. I taught GED classes to young mothers and fathers in Pittsburgh, in the Hill District, one of the poorest communities in Pittsburgh. And then I went to Braddock and to teach more GED classes and to help young people get a leg up in life and to help fight against a school system that expels and suspends black students at many, many times the rate of white students. And then I ran for mayor because 2 of my students were gunned down, and I fought against gun violence. And I went 5.5 years without the loss of life in my community. Furthermore, we pioneered and we adopted the most effective community policing model that I'm aware of, because we had these dramatic drops in crime without any corresponding rises in complaints from the citizens that we police. And finally, this war on drugs. Is anyone here a fan of this nation's war on drugs? Because I haven't met any. We know that this nation's war on drugs doesn't work, and we know that fixing that and fixing the mass incarceration problem that we have will only be the most important steps in eliminating the systemic racism that exists in this society. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, yes, Black Lives Matter, period, full stop. And it's beyond me why anyone feels pulled down when we recognize the dignity of another person. All of us are lifted up when we recognize that dignity. But you know what? Shame on us, too, if all we do is own that phrase and not see the reality that the progress that we have made, halting progress towards that arc of history genuinely bending towards justice, is very much at stake, every bit of it right now, because of systemic racism and because of concentrated poverty. We now have the shame of having an education system that has the biggest resource gap in the country between rich and poor. You know, we have a campaign to try to shut down schools and punish teachers. Really, when you go into those impoverished school districts, here's the deal. The kids are being tested on biology, but there's not a single certified biology teacher in that district, right? Or there's not a school book. I'll tell you, when we first came into office with Governor Wolf, we fought like heck and got it done. A fair funding formula for our schools. Your education should not depend on your zip code. And we have to go further. You know what? When it comes to economic development, we need to ensure that the people who have been in a community and the pillars of community can afford to stay in that community or not chased out. And we also need to make sure that when it comes to policing in these communities, the police force needs to look like the community that it's operating in. Give people a chance.
Mr. Sestak.
Yes, in that health care bill, we made sure that we inserted that there would be health care hubs in the lower, and the underserved of our communities. We made sure not only ethnicity, but also race would be one of the indications used as a criteria to judge the health care bill's effectiveness. As far as small business, it was my legislation that tried to enhance and increase the minority small business loans. Why? They have the least default rate of any loans from the Small Business Administration. And that's why I tried to have created minority small business development centers. There's a lot to be done for livelihoods, but let's make sure we take care of their lives first. Thank you.
Mr. Fetterman?
Yeah, you want to know what systemic racism can look like in Pennsylvania? I'm sure you can all see it. This is a bar chart of lead poisoning rates in Pennsylvania cities. And this blue line is actually Flint. So all of this to this side is in excess of Flint, which is the poster child for lead poisoning. Those children are overwhelmingly African American. They come from the wrong zip code. And my campaign is all about your zip code should not determine your destiny. Thank you.
Ms. McGinty?
Well, a key piece of this, as we know, is criminal justice reform. You know, when we think about the crash of Wall Street, are you kidding me? We had these crooks that nearly crippled our economy, and they walk free, whereas a kid with a little pot in his pocket is thrown in the slammer. Every bit of that is wrong. We're now a Commonwealth that spends much more on the jails than we spend on colleges, $2 billion. On a positive note, Representative Patty Kim was going to be here. I want to shout out to her and Representative Jordan Harris. They made it happen. They got the expungement bill passed. That's a second chance, a new lease on life. Thank you to those representatives.
Okay, our next question is from the audience. Labor rights are increasingly being attacked. What will you do to strengthen the National Labor Relations Board, improve workers' rights to organize, and expand collective bargaining? The question goes to Mr. Fetterman first.
Well, again, nobody knows in this room better than I do just how much labor is under siege. I live across the street from a steel mill. I live across the street from a union hall. And until we're able to get big money out of politics, we're only going to continue to get these ridiculous trade agreements. We're only going to continue to get trade policies that are stilted towards China's favor. We in this country have to affirm that a $15 minimum wage is the floor, not the ceiling. Our labor practices, we've been declaring war on organized labor for the last 30 years, and we'll look at what has happened to our middle class. It is now on the verge of extinction. When will we in this country finally affirm that we cannot have a thriving, vital middle class unless we affirm the strength and the dignity of organized labor, both in the private sector but also in the public sector? And until we, thank you, and until we enshrine those protections to organize, we in this country are going to continue to witness the middle class in this country withering away, and with it, the secure foundation of our American democracy. Thank you.
You know, I come from a union household with 10 kids in the family, and my dad a policeman, my mom working at nights in a restaurant. There was one reason why my dad was able to put his head on the pillow and he breathed his last at 94 with dignity, and that is the union had his back. He earned a pension walking that beat for 35 years, and he had that pension that gave him dignity in his retirement. Look, I am proud in this race to be endorsed and supported by organized labor, by the building trades, by nurses, by teachers. Why? Because I went and I stood, one example, with nurses who were being treated terribly by the facility they worked at. What happened? They organized. They formed a union. 88% voted in favor. Management found out and used hard-earned, altogether too few Medicare dollars to try to bust their union. They stood up and they spoke out. Why? Not because of themselves. They were working in an addiction and mental health clinic. They stood up and I joined them with the cameras rolling because their punishment was that on Monday they would work in one unit, on Tuesday another unit, and they knew for mental and behavioral health patients that was horribly upsetting, horribly injurious. They were serving those patients. That's what organized labor is about. Proud workers doing a good job, deserving respect, and deserving decent wages and benefits. I've been proud to walk that picket line with labor, and I will do so in defense of those critical rights.
Mr. Sestak?
My AFL-CIO voting record is 100%. I never asked the union, this race or against Senator Specter, for an endorsement. I support labor for one reason, because they are the last organized force in America for the working family. Because in their charter of AFL-CIO, they say they are for the working family. I don't work for unions. I work to support them so they can help working families. It's why I voted for to have first responders have the right nationally to unionize. It's why I stood down there and voted for bills for OSHA to come under the NLRB and to have better oversight. Why? Go into a popcorn factory and have a scientist 15 years ago say it's like breathing acid when you work there. And we haven't been able to get one bill passed in a decade that takes care of the health and safety of our workers. That's what unions are for, and they fought with me down there every day to try to get that and other bills passed. And Pat Toomey voted to overturn the one bill that got through in the last 12 years. I'm for unions. My record shows it. But I'm for them because I'm for working families above any special interest. That's why I'm for unions. And my record's 100%. Thank you.
Mr. Fetterman, do you have a rebuttal?
Yeah. I'm 46 years old, and in all those years, I've yet to meet a greedy union member. Thank you. All they want was just a crack at the middle-class life, to maybe have a car or two in the garage, to take a summer vacation, have enough money for their kids to go to school. But I have met greedy CEOs like the U.S. Steel CEO who paid himself $13 million while he held out the contract for the union brothers and sisters at the mill at my plant. I am pro-union, pro-labor, and I will fight as your United States Senator for those causes.
You know, the golden age in America's economy came 50s, 60s, when manufacturing jobs used to be dirty jobs. They used to be unsafe jobs, and they were not well-paid jobs. People organized. They got together. That's what created the great middle class in this country. The next chapter, though, is important. Service jobs are a big and growing part of our economy. We need that same focus to say service jobs also need to be good jobs, to be family-sustaining jobs. That's not anyone in the service industry asking for a handout. That's the recipe for the next golden era of America's economy, when that part of our economy becomes good family-sustaining jobs as well.
Rebuttal, Mr. Sestak?
Let me give you the template from which I approach unions and other issues. Come on into the military. Man, woman, any race, no matter what, you get equal pay. And those wages rise all the time. Come on in, and in this union of our military, everyone gets health care. Everyone gets education. You can't even be promoted to be a senior enlisted without at least an associate's college degree. Come on in and earn a pension. I used to say everybody in the military is a Democrat, they just don't know it. No longer. I think it's pretty obvious that's what unions stand for. How can you not be for supporting unions when for that for the working family?
And now we'll have our closing statements. Each candidate will get 2 minutes. And we'll start with Mr. Sestak.
Thank you very much, everyone. And Bernice, thank you. There's a saying in the military, I've got your 6. You quietly say it to the buddy next to you whenever you go off on an operation. You don't say we're going to fight. You just say, I've got your 6. That's because the 6 is underneath the 12. And when that arm is pointing down there, it's a man or woman standing tall to have the protection of the number 12. I lived in the military, and I loved it till my daughter got brain cancer. I needed to get out to serve her. I had the country 6 every day and the brethren I fought with. But this country had my 6 when it gave me my daughter back, 14 years old now, going on 22. I got into politics because I needed to pay back. It was my payback tour, and I wanted to have the 6 of everyone I served. Republican, Democrat, Independent in my Republican district. It's the second Democrat since the Civil War. And I won my second race by 20 points, not even spending any money on a television or print ad, because I had their 6, those 18,000 constituents, which is larger population than 97% of all cities, boroughs, and municipalities in Pennsylvania. 18,000 walked in the door to say, can you have me? Help me. Can you have my 6? I went down to Congress and fought for that. And then I didn't want anything else from this country because I still owed it, why I turned down the lobbying jobs and went to teach with our National Treasure of the Youth. And then served on the Center for Disaster Relief. I saw so much, and education. I'm running for the United States Senate because I want to have this country's, Pennsylvania's 6th. I want to serve them. You can't do better for yourself than by serving others above yourself and having the courage to stand tall for what's right every day, willing to lose for them, willing to sacrifice it all for them, but in my case, making sure I win for them. Thank you.
We'll have Ms. McGinty.
Thank you. All of you in this room stand for values that are enduring: the dignity of the human person, the right of every person to their privacy, the right of every person to make their own health choices, the right of every person to have the dignity of joy and joy of being able to marry the person they love. You stand for strength in numbers, organizing, bargaining, sticking up for people who show up for work every day and give it all they got, and all they want is to be able to take care of themselves, their kids, and you know what happens. You enable a person to have a decent job, and we've seen it time and again. They're the leaders of their community. Those are the people, the hardworking people and working families. They're the ones who are volunteering to fight fires. I had some volunteer firefighters say to me recently, well, everybody's working minimum wage jobs. We don't have as many volunteer firefighters, and the CEOs haven't stepped up to help on the fires. You've had the back of hardworking people in this country. I've been blessed to live a piece of the American dream, the first in my family to go to college, and then the privilege of sitting in front of you here tonight, asking for your support. I want to thank you. You're making a difference in this world. We're at a critical juncture. This world needs your passion. It needs your values. It needs your commitment to what's right. And I am privileged to ask you tonight to consider supporting me in this critical race as we fight for the future of our families and this great country. Thank you very much.
You know, I was in Philadelphia for a campaign event a couple weeks ago, and I was walking to an event, and it was in the evening, and I had something really special happen. I was walking down the street, and I had 2 random strangers come up and say, "You're that guy running for the Senate, man. You're awesome. I got your vote." And then by the time I got to the event, I had 2 other strangers cross the street because they thought I was going to mug them. My journey to this stage today is an unusual one because I grew up in a Republican household. My parents are right there at the table. I want to thank Mom and Dad for being here. And one of my lame campaign jokes that we've all heard each other's lame jokes, is that I hope I'm the first Democrat that my parents vote for. And it's true. My father just changed his registration online, and he said, "John, Only for you and Jesus am I going to do this. And I'm still working, and I'm still working on my mom. Think about the values that you hold dear. Think of the things that you would work 40 to 50 hours a week for and do that for 11 years. And that's how much I value social justice. Because as mayor of my community, my salary is $150 a month. And that's how much I care about social justice. That's how much I care about Black Lives Matter. That's how much I care about gun control. I wear my heart on my sleeve, so to speak. This number right here is my town zip code, 15104. And the other arm is another issue dear in my heart. These are dates when people have been murdered in my town since I've been mayor. I take this very seriously. It has been an honor to be up here on the stage with these candidates and in this lovely forum with all you amazing, wonderful progressives that make the world go round. Thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to seeing more of you afterwards.